Edit. The most dangerous mistake in a room full of powerful people is assuming the quietest person has nothing worth saying. Rain drummed softly against the towering windows of the Moretti estate as black luxury sedans disappeared through the wrought iron gates, leaving behind a mansion where billion-dollar decisions were made with calm voices instead of loud ones. Crystal chandeliers cast warm reflections across polished marble floors while executives, international investors, attorneys, and translators gathered around a conference table carved from American walnut, each seat carefully assigned weeks in advance for what was expected to become the largest overseas shipping agreement Vincent Moretti had ever signed. Every document had already been reviewed, every translation certified, every presentation rehearsed. Nothing was supposed to go wrong. Claire Bennett adjusted the cuff of her modest black, Maid uniform before quietly arranging porcelain coffee cups onto a silver serving cart. She moved carefully, almost invisibly, replacing empty glasses, folding linen napkins, and keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. 8 months working inside the mansion had taught her one lesson above all others. Invisible people survived. Invisible people were trusted because they never interrupted conversations that belonged to people with titles, expensive watches, and corner offices. She intended to remain invisible for the rest of the morning. Vincent Moretti entered the conference room precisely at 9 o'clock. Conversation stopped without anyone asking for silence. At 38 years old, he carried himself with effortless authority, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that reflected discipline rather than extravagance. His expression remained composed as he greeted foreign guests with brief nods before taking his place at the head of the table. "Let's begin," he said quietly. The meeting unfolded with practiced precision. English shifted naturally into Italian. Italian gave way to Japanese. French followed, then Arabic as interpreters translated every sentence with polished confidence. Lawyers compared multilingual contracts projected across enormous digital displays while investors discussed shipping routes stretching from New York to Yokohama, Marseille, Naples, and Dubai. Claire continued pouring coffee without paying attention, or at least pretending not to. Then one sentence froze her completely. A Japanese executive calmly explained a temporary operational partnership designed to protect both companies equally. The interpreter translated something entirely different. Ownership instead of operational authority. Claire felt her fingers tighten around the silver coffee pot. It sounded like one word. It was not one word. It was the difference between cooperation and surrender. Around the table, no one reacted. Attorneys highlighted paragraphs without hesitation. Executives nodded with complete confidence. Vincent uncapped his fountain pen as the final contract slid toward him. Claire's heartbeat echoed inside her ears. She looked at the polished marble floor, telling herself to remain silent. It was not her place. She was a maid, not an attorney, not an executive, not someone invited to speak. Yet the sentence repeated inside her mind exactly as she had heard it. Her late father had spent years teaching comparative linguistics, reminding her that language was never merely vocabulary. Every word carried intention, law, and consequence. One careless translation could reshape an entire agreement without anyone realizing it until years later. Vincent lifted the pen above the signature line. The conference room seemed to shrink around Claire. Outside, thunder rolled across the Manhattan skyline, while rain blurred the city into streaks of silver and gray. Inside, dozens of experienced professionals waited for a signature that could redefine an international partnership. Claire realized she had only seconds left to decide whether protecting the truth was worth risking the only job standing between her and the quiet life she had worked so hard to rebuild. Claire's breathing became slow and deliberate as she forced herself to think instead of surrendering to fear. Every instinct she had developed over the past 8 months told her to lower her eyes, step away from the conference table, and allow the people with titles to continue making decisions that belonged to them. She was only responsible for coffee, clean glasses, and polished silver. She was not responsible for correcting international contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet the Japanese sentence echoed through her mind again with absolute clarity. The interpreter had not made a harmless grammatical mistake. He had transformed a temporary operating partnership into permanent ownership. That single change could alter the entire balance of the agreement. Vincent Moretti's fountain pen hovered just above the signature line while every executive around the table waited with complete confidence. Claire looked down at the polished marble floor, hoping someone else would notice. No one did. The attorneys remained focused on highlighted paragraphs. The translators sat comfortably with the quiet confidence that came from years of professional experience. Foreign investors patiently waited for the formal signing ceremony to begin. Claire realized that silence would become her decision just as much as speaking would. Before fear could stop her, she heard her own voice break the stillness. "Excuse me, Mr. Moretti." The room froze instantly. Even the soft sound of rain against the windows seemed to disappear. Vincent slowly lowered the pen without signing the document and lifted his eyes toward the young maid standing beside the coffee cart. His expression revealed nothing. Several executives exchanged confused glances while the chief interpreter frowned with visible annoyance. Claire immediately felt every heartbeat echo through her chest, but she remained standing exactly where she was. "The translation isn't correct, sir," she said quietly. A short laugh escaped from one of the legal consultants before he quickly stopped himself. The chief interpreter leaned back in his chair with practiced confidence. "I'm certain there has been a misunderstanding," he replied. International legal language often sounds unusual to someone unfamiliar with it. A few people nodded in agreement. Someone whispered, "She's housekeeping." Another quietly smiled as though the interruption had become an unexpected joke. Claire ignored every reaction. Vincent continued watching her without speaking. Finally, he asked a single question. "Explain." Claire took one careful breath before turning respectfully toward the visiting chairman from Osaka. She greeted him in fluent Japanese, apologizing politely for interrupting the meeting before asking him to confirm the intention behind the disputed clause. The chairman's eyebrows lifted in obvious surprise, yet he answered naturally, as though speaking with another experienced negotiator. Their conversation lasted less than half a minute, but when it ended, every person around the table understood something extraordinary had just happened. Claire turned back toward Vincent. He confirmed the proposal creates a renewable operating partnership with shared oversight, she said calmly. The English translation incorrectly changes operational authority into ownership rights. Those concepts are completely different under commercial law. Before anyone could respond, she gently opened the French version of the contract and pointed toward a paragraph near the bottom of the page. Switching effortlessly into French, she explained another inconsistency before continuing into Italian to clarify a financial provision and then into Arabic to verify an important cultural expression connected to contractual obligations. Each conversation flowed naturally, without hesitation or theatrical confidence. She never raised her voice. She simply spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who respected every language enough to understand what it truly meant. When she finished, the conference room remained absolutely silent. The chief interpreter no longer smiled. Several attorneys hurriedly reopened their documents, comparing original texts against translated copies with growing concern. Vincent rested the fountain pen on the table and studied Claire as though seeing her for the very first time, while everyone else slowly realized the quiet maid they had overlooked possessed knowledge that none of them had expected to find. The chairman from Osaka slowly closed his portfolio and looked directly at Vincent before speaking in calm, deliberate English. "Miss Bennett translated our proposal correctly." The words settled over the conference room with quiet authority, stripping away the confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier. Every attorney immediately reached for another copy of the contract while tablets illuminated across the polished walnut table. The chief legal counsel adjusted his glasses and began comparing the English version against the original Japanese text, his expression growing more uncertain with every paragraph. Claire remained exactly where she stood beside the silver coffee cart, wishing she could disappear back into the background where no one expected anything from her. She had never interrupted the meeting to embarrass anyone. She had only wanted the agreement to reflect the truth. The chief interpreter cleared his throat before forcing a polite smile. "Commercial language often allows multiple interpretations," he said carefully. "Certain expressions can reasonably be translated in different ways." Claire answered respectfully, without raising her voice. "Not in this clause. The original sentence limits operational authority for a defined period. Permanent ownership requires completely different legal terminology." The Japanese chairman nodded immediately. She is correct. A quiet murmur spread across the room. One executive who had smiled at Claire only moments earlier now stared silently at the contract in front of him. Another attorney quickly erased several handwritten notes before beginning the review again from the first page. Vincent observed every reaction without speaking. Years of leading international negotiations had taught him that pressure revealed character more honestly than comfort ever could. Some people accepted responsibility. Others searched for explanations. Others protected their pride before protecting the facts. He had learned to recognize every version. Finally, the head of legal broke the silence. Mr. Moretti, perhaps we should postpone today's signing until the entire translation package can be independently verified. Vincent looked toward him calmly. I believe that verification had already been completed yesterday. No one answered. The rain continued, falling beyond the towering windows while the conference room seemed noticeably colder than before. Claire quietly lowered her eyes, convinced her role in the meeting had ended. Instead, Vincent asked a question no one expected. Miss Bennett, how many languages do you speak fluently? She hesitated for only a moment. 5, sir. Which ones? English, Japanese, Italian, French, and Arabic. Several investors exchanged surprised glances while one visiting executive leaned back slowly in his chair, studying Claire with genuine curiosity. Vincent remained expressionless. Where did you learn them? Claire answered honestly. My father taught comparative linguistics at Columbia University before he passed away. My mother translated historical manuscripts for academic publishers. They believed language should always be understood before it is translated. The explanation was simple, almost understated. She spoke without trying to impress anyone, describing her past as though it belonged to another lifetime. One senior consultant frowned. If that's true, why are you working as a maid? Claire paused briefly before answering. Because education doesn't always protect people from hardship, and honest work is still honest work. The room became silent once again. There was no resentment in her voice, no attempt to defend herself, only quiet dignity. Vincent noticed something none of the others seemed to recognize. Claire never once criticized the professionals who had underestimated her. She never reminded anyone that she had been right. She simply answered every question with humility and precision. Around the conference table, attorneys continued reviewing every translated page with renewed urgency. Yet Vincent had already shifted his attention away from the contracts. He was no longer studying documents. He was studying the people who had approved them without truly understanding them, and the quiet woman who had risked everything because she believed the truth deserved a voice, no matter who happened to speak it. Edit Vincent quietly closed the contract without writing a single signature. The soft sound of the leather binder meeting the table echoed through the conference room with surprising weight, and every executive instinctively understood that the meeting had entered an entirely different stage. It was no longer about negotiating an international partnership. It had become a question of judgment, responsibility, and trust. Vincent rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the towering windows overlooking the rain-soaked Manhattan skyline. Reflections of city lights shimmered across the glass while no one dared interrupt the silence. Behind him, attorneys compared original contracts against translated versions with a level of urgency that had been absent only minutes before. Claire remained beside the serving cart, her hands folded neatly in front of her, convinced she had already crossed a line that could never be undone. She knew enough about organizations built on hierarchy to understand one painful truth. Correcting powerful people rarely made them grateful. More often, it made them uncomfortable. After nearly 2 full minutes, Vincent finally spoke without turning around. Mr. Ellis. The head of legal immediately straightened in his chair. Yes, sir. Who approved today's multilingual review? Ellis cleared his throat. Our translation department completed the verification yesterday afternoon. I authorized the final package after receiving their certification. Vincent nodded almost imperceptibly. How many people reviewed it before it reached my desk? Ellis glanced toward the stack of contracts. 7, including myself. Silence followed once again. Vincent had learned long ago that silence often uncovered more truth than interrogation ever could. The chief interpreter leaned forward, determined to recover his confidence. Mr. Moretti, international legal translation is rarely perfect. Minor differences appear in nearly every negotiation. Vincent slowly turned toward the Japanese chairman. Would you describe this as a minor difference? The chairman answered immediately. Absolutely not. Had we signed the English version, our companies would have spent years disputing obligations that neither side intended to create. We would have believed your organization deliberately altered the agreement. Several executives lowered their eyes. One consultant quietly removed his glasses while another closed his notebook without saying a word. The polished certainty that had filled the room all morning had completely disappeared. Vincent walked back toward the conference table before stopping only a few feet from Claire. She kept her attention on the marble floor, expecting criticism rather than conversation. Instead, his voice remained calm. Look at me, Miss Bennet. She lifted her eyes carefully. There was no anger in his expression, only careful observation. When did you recognize the mistake? During the first translated paragraph, sir. Why didn't you interrupt immediately? Claire answered honestly. Because I assumed I might be mistaken. I reviewed every related clause in my head before saying anything. I wanted to be certain before correcting professionals who knew far more than I did. Vincent studied her for several quiet seconds. So you verified your own conclusion before speaking? Yes, sir. A senior advisor finally broke the silence. Mr. Moretti, regardless of today's outcome, we cannot encourage household staff to interrupt executive negotiations whenever they believe something sounds incorrect. There has to be professional order. Several people nodded cautiously, relieved that someone had finally expressed what many of them had been thinking. Claire felt her stomach tighten, but she remained silent. Vincent slowly shifted his attention toward the advisor. His expression never changed, yet the atmosphere somehow grew even heavier. Interesting, he said quietly. So your concern isn't that she identified an error. He allowed the unfinished thought to linger just long enough for every person in the room to understand where it was leading. Your concern is that the person who identified it happened to be wearing a maid's uniform. No one answered. Outside, the rain continued tracing silver lines across the glass while inside the conference room every carefully protected assumption about authority, intelligence, and status began to collapse. Not because Claire had demanded respect, but because truth had quietly spoken through the one voice. Everyone had overlooked. The conference room remained silent long after Vincent's words settled over the polished walnut table. No one challenged his reasoning. No one defended the hierarchy that had failed only minutes earlier. Outside, the rain softened into a steady rhythm against the towering windows while inside. The only sound came from attorneys quietly turning pages they suddenly realized they should have read more carefully the first time. Vincent slowly returned to his chair without reopening the contract. Instead, he folded his hands and surveyed every face around the room with the same calm expression that had guided countless negotiations over the years. We will take a 30-minute recess, he said. No documents leave this room. No phone calls regarding this agreement will be made until I return. His voice remained measured, but no one mistook it for a suggestion. Chairs moved quietly across the marble floor as executives formed small groups, whispering to one another while comparing translated pages with growing unease. Claire remained beside the serving cart, uncertain whether she should continue collecting coffee cups or simply leave before someone ordered her out. Before she could decide, Vincent looked directly at her. Miss Bennet. She immediately straightened. Yes, sir. Come with me. Every conversation stopped as she followed him through the carved oak doors leading toward his private study. The long hallway felt unusually quiet. Family portraits, antique clocks, and polished hardwood reflected decades of tradition, yet Claire noticed none of them. Her thoughts remained fixed on one possibility. She had embarrassed too many important people. Whatever happened next would probably end her employment. Vincent entered the study and quietly closed the door behind them. Shelves lined with books on economics, history, diplomacy, and international law covered the walls. Rain filtered through tall windows, bathing the room in muted gray light. Vincent remained standing behind his desk instead of sitting. For several moments, he simply observed Claire with thoughtful silence before asking an unexpected question. How many universities accepted you? Claire blinked in surprise. 3, sir. Which one did you attend? Columbia University. Vincent nodded slightly. Comparative linguistics? She looked genuinely startled. Yes, sir. Your vocabulary changes whenever you discuss language. Most people don't realize how much education reveals itself through ordinary conversation. Claire lowered her eyes. I never intended to hide my education. Then why have you spent 8 months serving coffee? The question lingered in the quiet room. Claire answered slowly, choosing honesty over pride. My parents passed away within the same year. Their medical expenses exhausted everything we had saved. I left graduate school to support my younger brother until he finished college. After that, surviving became more urgent than returning to my career. Vincent listened without interrupting. What does your brother do now? A small smile appeared on Claire's face. He's an elementary school teacher in Seattle. He loves his students. The smile faded almost immediately, replaced once again by quiet composure. Vincent noticed she never described her sacrifices as extraordinary. She spoke about them as though they were simply responsibilities that life had placed before her. He walked to a cabinet and removed 5 folders written in different languages before placing them neatly across the desk. Translate the legal differences, he said. Claire looked at the documents, then back at him. Now, sir. Now. She nodded once and opened the first folder. The room became silent except for the gentle turning of pages. Vincent walked toward the window overlooking the rain, but his attention never drifted to the skyline beyond the glass. Instead, he listened to the quiet confidence with which Claire worked, already beginning to suspect that the greatest oversight inside his organization had never been a mistranslated contract. It had been allowing someone with extraordinary ability to spend 8 months believing that her only purpose inside the Moretti estate was to remain invisible. Claire reached for the first folder with steady hands despite the uncertainty still lingering inside her. 5 agreements lay across Vincent's desk, each written in a different language and each representing years of business relationships built on precision and trust. She opened the Japanese contract first, reading every sentence exactly as her father had taught her long ago. Never translate individual words before understanding the intention behind the entire thought. Language was never a collection of vocabulary. It was a reflection of culture, law, and responsibility. The room remained almost perfectly silent except for the quiet sound of paper turning beneath her fingertips and rain tapping softly against the tall windows. Vincent stood near the glass without interrupting, giving no indication whether this was an interview, a final examination, or simply an opportunity to understand who Claire Bennett truly was. Nearly 20 minutes passed before she carefully organized the folders into a single stack and looked up. There are 9 legal inconsistencies, sir. Vincent turned from the window. Only 9. Claire nodded politely. 9 legal inconsistencies. For stylistic differences that don't affect the agreements. 2 cultural adaptations intended to improve readability. Those should remain unchanged. The legal inconsistencies should not. Vincent walked back toward the desk and sat opposite her for the first time since entering the study. Show me. Claire opened the Italian agreement first. This clause changes shared liability into proportional liability. The wording appears similar in English, but under Italian commercial law the responsibilities become significantly different during transportation delays. She placed the document aside before opening the French version. Here the deadline appears identical, but the French wording allows extensions under exceptional commercial circumstances. The English translation removes that protection entirely. She continued through each folder with calm precision, explaining Arabic contractual etiquette, Japanese legal nuance, and subtle English phrasing that altered financial obligations without drawing attention to itself. She never hurried. She never attempted to impress him. Every observation was supported by careful reasoning, instead of confidence alone. When she finished, Vincent quietly compared her notes with the legal review prepared by his own department. Every inconsistency she identified matched issues his attorneys had either overlooked or dismissed until she interrupted the meeting. He slowly closed the folders before resting his hands together. Who else inside this organization knows you can do this? Claire looked genuinely surprised. No one, sir. Not even Mrs. Alvarez. She gently shook her head. She hired me because she needed someone dependable. She asked whether I could maintain the house, protect privacy, and work carefully. My education never became part of the conversation. Vincent studied her expression closely. There was no resentment in her voice. No disappointment. She spoke as though life had simply followed a different road than the one she had planned. Most people spent years trying to convince the world they deserved greater opportunities. Claire had quietly accepted whatever honest work allowed her to move forward. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Vincent's executive assistant stepped inside. "Sir, everyone is waiting in the conference room." Vincent acknowledged him with a brief nod. 10 more minutes. After the door closed again, he looked back toward Claire. "One final question." She answered immediately. "Yes, sir. When you interrupted my meeting, were you hoping someone would finally recognize your abilities?" Claire lowered her eyes for only a moment before meeting his gaze again. "No, sir. I only hoped no one would sign something they didn't truly understand." The answer lingered in the quiet study long after the words themselves had faded. Vincent had spent years surrounded by accomplished professionals who proudly spoke about ethics, loyalty, and responsibility whenever an audience was listening. Yet none of those polished speeches carried the quiet honesty contained in a single sentence spoken by a woman who had expected nothing for herself. Without realizing when it happened, Vincent understood that he had stopped testing Claire's knowledge. He had begun measuring the character of everyone else against hers. When Vincent pushed open the conference room doors, every conversation ended before the first word was spoken. Executives immediately returned to their seats while the international delegation quietly resumed their places around the polished walnut table. The atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier that morning, confidence had filled the room. Now every glance carried caution. Every document was treated with new respect. Claire followed several steps behind Vincent, intending to return quietly to the serving cart where she believed her responsibilities still belonged. Before she reached it, Vincent spoke without looking back. "Miss Bennett, take the open seat beside the legal department." She stopped immediately. Several executives lifted their heads in visible surprise. That chair had always been reserved for senior advisors involved in negotiations. Claire hesitated. "Sir, I don't believe that's appropriate." Vincent calmly met her eyes. "Neither was allowing inaccurate contracts to reach my desk." No one objected. Claire slowly crossed the room and sat where he had instructed, carefully placing her hands together as though she still expected someone to tell her she did not belong there. Vincent resumed his position at the head of the table. "We will begin again from page 1. The review lasted nearly an hour. Every paragraph was examined in every language before moving forward. Whenever uncertainty appeared, Vincent asked Claire before anyone else. She never interrupted discussions. She waited until invited, then explained each issue with quiet precision, supporting every observation with clear reasoning rather than opinion. The chairman from Osaka smiled several times as she clarified cultural expressions often misunderstood in literal translations. The French legal advisor acknowledged that one of her explanations prevented an insurance obligation from being interpreted incorrectly. Even the Arabic investor complimented her understanding of formal business etiquette embedded within specific contractual phrases. Slowly, skepticism disappeared from the room. Respect replaced it without anyone announcing that it had happened. Only one person remained visibly uncomfortable. The chief interpreter spoke less with every passing minute, reviewing his own notes repeatedly while avoiding eye contact with both Claire and Vincent. The attorneys who had dismissed her earlier quietly corrected their annotations, hoping their earlier confidence would be forgotten. Vincent forgot nothing. He had built his career by remembering details other people overlooked. Once the final multilingual review had been completed, the Japanese chairman rose from his chair and extended his hand toward Vincent. "Mr. Moretti, today's agreement succeeds because someone inside your organization chose honesty over silence. That deserves recognition." Vincent accepted the handshake with a respectful nod. "I couldn't agree more." This time the signatures were placed on every document without hesitation because every sentence had been verified beyond doubt. Soft applause spread naturally through the conference room as months of negotiations officially came to a successful conclusion. Relief appeared across the faces of investors, attorneys, and advisors alike. Claire quietly gathered and used folders and empty coffee cups, believing the extraordinary events of the day had finally reached their end. She expected tomorrow to look exactly like yesterday. She expected to wake before sunrise, prepare breakfast trays, polish silver, and disappear once again into the quiet rhythm of ordinary work. She had no idea that Vincent had already reached a decision long before the final signature touched the page. As the international guests departed, thanking the staff and offering respectful nods toward Claire, Vincent remained seated, silently watching members of his own executive team congratulate one another for a successful negotiation they had nearly compromised. He observed the relieved smiles, the careful excuses, and the subtle attempts to protect professional reputations. Then his eyes settled on Claire as she carried a tray toward the service entrance with the same humility she had shown before anyone knew her name. In that quiet moment, Vincent realized that qualifications could be listed on paper, experience could be measured by years, and titles could be awarded by organizations. But integrity revealed itself only when someone risked everything simply because allowing the truth to remain silent was never an acceptable choice. The final black sedan disappeared beyond the estate gates as the evening sky slowly brightened after hours of rain. Inside the mansion, employees quietly returned the conference room to its familiar perfection, replacing crystal glasses, collecting signed contracts, and polishing the long walnut table until no trace remained of the extraordinary afternoon that had unfolded there. Claire carried a silver tray toward the service hallway with the same measured pace she had followed every day since arriving at the Moretti estate. In her mind, nothing had truly changed. The negotiations were over. The guests had gone home. Tomorrow she would wake before sunrise, prepare breakfast trays, dust the library, and continue living the quiet life she had accepted long ago. Before she reached the hallway, Mrs. Alvarez hurried toward her, her expression unusually serious. "Mr. Moretti wants every department head in the conference room immediately," she said in a hushed voice. Then she hesitated before adding something that left Claire completely speechless. "He specifically asked for you as well." Claire looked around as though someone else might answer in her place. "Me?" Mrs. Alvarez nodded slowly. "I've worked here for 17 years. I've never seen housekeeping called into an executive meeting after negotiations." Minutes later, managers, attorneys, translators, executive assistants, security supervisors, and administrative directors gathered around the same conference table where the international agreement had been signed. There were no foreign investors now, no interpreters speaking into headsets, no cameras recording historic partnerships. Only employees quietly wondering why they had been summoned back after business hours. Claire remained near the rear wall beside Mrs. Alvarez, hoping to attract as little attention as possible. Vincent entered precisely at 6 o'clock carrying a single black folder. He placed it gently on the table before looking around the room with calm, deliberate patience. "Today's meeting revealed 2 problems," he began. "The first was an inaccurate translation. The second concerns me far more." I remained fixed on him. Mistakes happen inside every organization. What determines the future of that organization is how people respond once those mistakes are discovered. He paused briefly. Several individuals today protected titles before protecting facts. They defended assumptions before asking questions. They worried more about embarrassment than accuracy. No one attempted to interrupt. The legal department sat silently with lowered eyes while the translation team remained perfectly still. Vincent opened the folder. Effective immediately, the current translation division will be dissolved. Every employee affected will receive full severance benefits, professional references, and assistance transitioning into future employment. This decision reflects organizational accountability, not personal resentment. A wave of stunned silence spread across the room. The chief interpreter slowly lowered his head, realizing there would be no argument capable of changing what had already been decided. Vincent closed the folder again before turning toward the back of the room. "Miss Bennett." Claire stepped forward quietly. "Yes, sir." Vincent studied her with the same composed expression he had maintained throughout the day. "This morning you interrupted a meeting you were never invited to join because remaining silent would have been easier for you, but far more costly for everyone else. You corrected experienced professionals without humiliating them. You answered every challenge without arrogance. You placed truth above personal comfort." Claire lowered her eyes. "I only did what I believed was right." Vincent nodded once. "Exactly." Another quiet moment settled over the room before he continued. "Beginning tomorrow morning, you will no longer report to housekeeping. You will report directly to my office as Director of International Language Review and Special Communications. The company will sponsor any remaining certifications you choose to complete because talent should never remain hidden simply because life temporarily placed it in the wrong position. The conference room fell completely silent. Claire searched for words, but found none. Around her, employees who had overlooked her for months now stared with genuine disbelief. Vincent offered no dramatic speech, no celebration, and no applause. He simply recognized what had always been true. Extraordinary ability had never suddenly appeared inside the Moretti estate. It had quietly been serving coffee while everyone else was too distracted by titles to notice. No one moved for several long seconds after Vincent finished speaking. The silence no longer carried uncertainty. It carried understanding. Claire stood quietly at the center of the conference room, still wearing the same black maid's uniform she had put on before sunrise, unable to believe that a single decision to speak honestly had changed the direction of her life. 8 months earlier, she had arrived at the Moretti estate carrying one small suitcase, a recommendation letter, and the hope that steady work would allow her to rebuild after losing almost everything. She had never asked anyone to recognize her education. She had never expected admiration. She had only wanted the dignity that came from earning an honest paycheck. Mrs. Alvarez stepped forward first. The veteran housekeeper smiled through eyes filled with quiet pride before gently taking Claire's hands into her own. "You were never just part of my staff," she whispered. "I simply didn't know how much you had been carrying inside you." Claire returned the smile with the same humility that had guided every decision she made. "You gave me a chance when I needed one. I'll always be grateful for that." One by one, employees crossed the room. A young legal assistant admitted he had laughed when Claire interrupted the meeting and apologized without making excuses. Another manager quietly confessed that he had judged her by a uniform instead of listening to her words. Claire accepted every apology with calm grace. She never reminded anyone that they had underestimated her. She never spoke about proving anyone wrong. She simply thanked them for their honesty because she understood that admitting a mistake required courage too. Vincent watched the scene from the far end of the room without saying a word. Years of leadership had taught him that rules could shape behavior, but only character could change culture. What happened before him could never have been achieved through policies alone. Respect had grown naturally because truth had been stronger than pride. The following Monday morning, the Moretti estate appeared almost unchanged. Morning sunlight reflected across the marble floors. Fresh flowers filled the entrance hall. Staff members prepared breakfast while couriers delivered new international contracts. Yet something essential had changed beneath the familiar routine. Claire no longer entered through the service hallway carrying a silver coffee tray. She walked through the front office carrying multilingual agreements awaiting review. Every greeting she received was sincere. Every conversation reflected genuine respect instead of polite habit. Over the following months, international negotiations became smoother than ever before. Translation reviews expanded into training sessions where employees from every department were encouraged to ask questions without fear of embarrassment. Vincent introduced one principle that soon appeared in every internal handbook. The strongest idea in the room deserved attention regardless of the title, position, or uniform of the person presenting it. One afternoon, another international delegation visited the estate. After the meeting, a senior executive quietly asked Vincent where he had discovered such an exceptional language specialist. Vincent glanced toward Claire, who stood near the window carefully reviewing another contract with the same quiet focus she had always possessed. A faint smile crossed his face. "She was never discovered," he replied. "She was simply finally seen." The visitor nodded thoughtfully, though Vincent knew the lesson reached far beyond business. As the sun settled behind the Manhattan skyline, golden light stretched across the polished hallway where Claire had once pushed a coffee cart, hoping no one would notice her. She paused briefly, resting her hand on its familiar silver handle, before continuing toward her new office. It reminded her that no honest work had ever diminished her worth. Her value had never begun the day people recognized her talent. It had existed long before anyone chose to look closely enough to see it. And on that quiet evening, inside a mansion built on influence, discipline, and authority, everyone remembered that dignity never depends on where a person stands. It depends on who they choose to be when the truth needs a voice.